All right, if you haven't heard about Anchor, it's the easiest way to make a podcast. Now, just let me explain. First of all, it's free. Second of all, Anchor will distribute your podcast for you so it can be heard on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and a whole bunch more. And third, now this is really important, you can make money from your podcast with no minimum listenership. Hear me when I say no minimum listenership. It's everything you need to make a podcast in one place. Download the free Anchor app or go to anchor.fm to get started. All right, and welcome back to the Artenders, everybody. Today we have a very special guest with us. He is a several best-selling novelist. Including his most recent work, The Man Who Came Uptown. He is Emmy-nominated, fancy, and he has worked as a writer, creator, and producer on The Deuce, Treme, the Pacific, and The Wire, which is what brought us to him, how he got on our radar, and then obviously we've trickled into the rest of his career, and it's been absolutely insane. So speaking of the fact that you are Emmy-nominated, I'm curious right off the bat, are you an award hunter at all, or is it just like it's nice if you get one and that's really not even on the board for you at all?
Not really an award hunter. I will go if I'm nominated. I'll go out of courtesy, but I don't expect much. And I treated the Emmys like a date for my wife and I. You know, we went out there and we had some fun.
Oh, I'm sure. Did you ever live in LA, or were you always based in Baltimore?
I'm actually DC.
DC, I apologize. DC, I
Yeah,
apologize.
and I've never lived out west. I've only the only time I've left the DC area is to shoot. And you know, I've lived in New Orleans and I lived in New York for 3 years. And but basically, I've always lived here, and I'll stay here because my life's work is really writing about the city through the novels.
Did you live in New Orleans and New York for that extended period of time because of your work with Treme and The Deuce, respectively?
Yes, yeah. I was producing those shows too, so you have to be there all the time, and you really want to be there. If you're writing about a city that you're not that isn't your native city, you need to get out there and live in it. And I'm a walker anyway, so both of those places I walked around a lot at night. And when I was in New York, I never had a car, so I took the subway everywhere, including to set wherever it was. And that's how you learn a city is just. I mean, I've been doing it since I was a kid, really, and is being on out there in the world, public transportation, all that stuff, and listening to people talk.
We've been talking to writers recently a lot about how they get inspiration and where they know they're going to find material. In terms of just writing when they aren't directly inspired by something. Is that usually where you find it walking around in the city?
Yeah, I mean, that's where you hear the voices. And, if you have that, if you sort of have that gene, that writer's gene, where you hear people talking and it sinks in. For me, it goes all the way back to when I was a kid here, and my dad had a diner downtown DC, and my mom and dad, I was 11 years old. They said it's time to go to work. So at 11, I would get on. At 11 years old, I got on the bus, the DC Transit, every day, and I went downtown and transferred to another bus. And I was on a bus for about 45 minutes every day on a public bus, and just it was a tremendously interesting time for a kid because it was the summer of '68, and it was right after the riots here in DC, and the city had changed. I was going through neighborhoods that had burned down, and I was on the bus with primarily Black Washingtonians because Washington was a Black city then. It was 75% Black. And what I saw was that the people had after this sort of cleansing event had this rain had come and cleared the streets, and the people had changed. And on top of that, this was the late '60s, was a time of upheaval with cultural revolution and that sort of thing. And there were a lot of exciting things happening in the city that for a guy who was going to be a writer and I didn't know it yet, it was tremendously stimulating to me, and it formed me. I mean, my parents are gone, but silently I always thank them for giving me that opportunity to go to work at 11 years old in a city by myself, because that's what made me a writer.
When did you finally come to that decision when you were older, before you had written your first novel, Firing Offense, in 1992? When was it that you had that sort of epiphany to yourself? Okay, I want to write a novel. This is what I want to do.
Well, it's a little complicated because I was a movie freak growing up, and I wanted to make movies. That was my goal. But then I started figuring out, well, somebody writes these movies, right? And there's that step too. Um, and I was a film major at the University of Maryland. That was still my goal when I was in college, and I was making short films and that kind of thing. And then my senior year, I took a class in detective fiction in crime fiction as an elective, just so I'd get an easy grade. I thought
It's a fantastic class.
Yeah.
it was awesome, man. I and this teacher, Charles Mish, this professor, turned me on to books and reading, and the first kind of books that I could relate to, because crime fiction is about the working class, as opposed to most American fiction is about people, winners, success. And I changed direction. I decided then that maybe I could do this myself. It's something that I thought I could do because I felt I was a good writer. I had teachers who told me growing up, you can write, you've got this talent, and it seemed like it was something attainable, as opposed to being a film director or a filmmaker, which seemed like a much harder thing to do, especially for a Greek American kid who was living in D.C. and was probably never going to go anywhere outside the city. So I changed direction, and I wrote a book when I was 31 years old, and it got published.
Wow. And that's so fascinating. That was your intro into crime fiction. That's wild. I thought that it would be, like the excitement of it or the types of stories that you end up telling, but it was the people that it attracted, or the characters that it attracted. That's fascinating.
Yeah, and the books that I read were really good books. The guy on the syllabus, it was Chandler and Hammett and Ross McDonald and John le Carre and John D. MacDonald. And in fact, the book that we read in that class, The Deep Blue Goodbye, which is the first Travis McGee novel, was probably the most influential book in terms of me wanting to become a writer. And there's an ending to that story because 40 years later, I just adapted it for Fox. And I think it's going to be a movie.
Wow.
That's really exciting. Wow.
That is unbelievable. Or or have you been able to meet with your professor since and tell him the exciting news?
He's passed away, but I'm in contact with his girlfriend, and we talk. And I've got a Polaroid picture of him right over my desk here.
That is fascinating. I'm sorry for your loss, but I mean, that's an incredible story, especially as an intro to writing.
Well, and also I know there's a lot of people that are listening to this that want to be writers. You have to realize also that I didn't know anybody. I didn't know any. I'd never been to New York, so I didn't know any publishers or agents or anybody in the business. I didn't go to a writing school, so where you make contacts, and that's one of the values of a writing school, is that your fellow students are all trying to be writers, and you eventually potentially can get an agent through them and that sort of thing. I didn't have any of those opportunities, and I wrote this book blindly, and I sent it up to New York without an agent, and it landed on the slush pile of an editor up there, and it took him a year to get back to me, and I sort of forgot about it. And he called and left a message on my answering machine a year later and said, "I just picked this up off the slush pile. We want to publish it." That's how I got started.
So you're now kind of fast forward a little bit. You're in the middle of your writing career, and you keep expanding this world with your characters, and how maybe like sometimes. So in the case of like you wrote a multitude of books that was centralized on Nick Stefanos. But then you would also expand into other books that's not necessarily about Nick Stefanos, maybe with Derek Strange instead, but then would still feature some of the same characters. What always kept you coming back to the same world that you constructed for your characters? What about the writing experience that really brought you back to that, as opposed to wanting to tell a new, fresh story outright?
Well, I think, in my mind, the world, the fictional world exists. It's real to me. So why wouldn't characters from previous novels be walking through it and making cameo appearances and that kind of thing? And so this world that I constructed was, to me, a real world. And once I got out of the Nick Stefanos of it all, those were first person novels, I think the books started to get better because I was writing about characters that weren't me. In effect, I was stretching out into third person and people who were unlike me and that sort of thing. And that's when the books got richer. But I always intended and continue to intend to stay here in that world when I'm writing books, because I'm trying to leave behind a library of books about Washington D.C. and that kind of go through time and different time periods and that sort of thing. And when I started, nobody was really writing about this city in that way. There are other writers now that are doing it and doing it well. But at the time, the Washington novel was about politics or was about the Pentagon, and the living city was never a part of Washington literature.
That is fascinating that you're talking about that. The where you go and this fictional world that you really consume yourself with. It kind of reminded me of, there was a video that I saw of you and a few other writers, and at one point you said that it takes you a good 5 or 6 months to have like your first draft, or not your first draft, like a rough draft, but to have your manuscript. And I'm curious, how long does it take for you personally to have a first rough draft? Or are you a get it done and then edit for as long as it takes? Or is it that it really takes you a very long time most of your time to get in that headspace and to really, figure out the world before you start writing?
Well, I usually front load all the research, and that might be a couple months of not just library research, but or now internet research, but also just getting out there and talking to people and doing the stuff that I used to do, which is riding with the police and all, attending trials, doing all these things. But once I start writing, I have a real strict regimen. I write 7 days a week. I write 2 shifts. I do a morning shift that goes to a late lunch, so 4 or 5 hours. And then I come back at night and I rewrite what I did in the morning, and with the idea that I'm ready to go forward the next day rather than get stuck on what I've written already. And in this way, and it's worked out for me historically, and I'm not saying that it's the only way to write a book or the right way, but for me, when I have my first draft done, that's pretty much the book. I've never gone back and done an extensive rewrite on a book. I've polished it at that point, and if I feel like it's ready, I'll send it up to New York.
Are there any books that you have written that once you like finish that draft and you're like, actually, no, I don't want to send this out? Are there any books that you have that haven't seen the light of day?
No.
That's fantastic.
Just a stone cold no, absolutely not.
What a record, though. That's insane. Do you start and stop, or are you like, once I've started it, I'm knee deep in the research and it's just too fascinating not to keep going?
I think it's more that you have to have faith. There are a lot of days where you're stuck and where you have a lot of doubt. about what you're doing, but you have to have the confidence that, especially after the first couple of books that I wrote, that at that point I knew I could do it and that it would work out. But I'm a really firm believer in going to work every day, and I don't believe in putting a book away for a month or a couple months and coming back to it. Um, I think you got to gut it out, and the more consistently you stay in that tunnel of daily work, the better the book is, because once you leave it, it's that much harder to get back into that tunnel, that creative tunnel. And so that's the way it's worked for me. Is you just, I guess my main statement is I don't believe in writer's block. I know it exists. You have to just work your way through it and not use it as a crutch.
Well, yeah, there's something I think really important about the fact that pretty much every single writer that we've talked to that has had a lot of success in their career, especially longevity, that they've written a bunch, most of, like, just like you said, you guys have made a full-time schedule for yourself. You have forced yourself into a work mentality, which I think is where some of the coolest work comes from, where some of your coolest pieces come from, because just like you said, it's a matter of research and find the story. If you're not, if you're not making one up all of a sudden, or you're not in your zone or in your pocket, then what do you do? Where you go there? And that's impeccable that you're able to find your way through that. I love the no writer's block thing. That's so good.
Well, I look at it again to bring my father up. He had his own business. He was very happy when he was at the diner, at the store, because it was his. You know what I mean? And so he turned the key in that lock every morning to open that place up. If he didn't do it, he wouldn't have made a living. So, I come down here to my office every day at 9 o'clock in the morning, and I open the doors, and I consider it to be a job. I get dressed every day. I'm in the house. I could be wearing some sweat clothes or something like that, or shorts, but I get dressed for work, and I treat it as such. And because I'm self-employed too, and you just have to treat it like a job. The art thing it comes with the work, but you have to do the work.
So now, kind of looking at yourself like through your career, and then seeing yourself then like as a novelist, and then also as a screenwriter, and then also as a producer. Could you speak on the experiences and what were different about those, and how maybe your experience as a screenwriter perhaps influenced your work as a novelist?
So at the end of, like, let's say the latter part of the 90s, one of my books got optioned for King Suckerman got optioned by Miramax, and I made it part of my deal that I would write the script for it, and so I did. It didn't get made, but the script got around, and I started getting calls to do script doctoring work for other productions, which I did. And then I hadn't done any television at that point, and in fact, I didn't have any aspirations to do television, because when I was growing up, television was like Barnaby Jones and the Beverly Hillbillies and all these big,
Right.
Yeah.
like, it wasn't something that you aspired to do. But then, I guess really Oz on HBO broke the door open, and at around this time, I met David Simon through his now wife, Laura Littman, the writer, and Laura and I were friends, and she gave David one of my books, and he read it, and he spoke to me, and he said, I've got this show I just sold to HBO. It's called The Wire, and he definitely underplayed it. He said, it's about police and drug dealers in Baltimore. Do you want to write an episode for a season? And because he read this book of mine, Sweet Forever, which was sort of a deep urban crime novel that touched on a lot of social issues. And I said, yeah, I'll give it a shot. So I wrote without being up there, I wrote my first episode, which is consequently it was the one where Wallace is killed by his friends.
Oh
And
my God.
that was made an impact. You know, a lot of people thought it was powerful, and David got, got a hold of me and he said, "Listen, I'd like you to come full time on season 2. We're planning this season about the dock workers, and there's going to be a lot of Greeks in it. We need somebody who can, speak Greek and write Greek dialogue and that kind of thing." Little did I know that the Greek wasn't even Greek, as everybody knows now. You know, it was such an inconsequential part of that season. But he just wanted me to work on the show. So I came up and I eventually became a producer, and I worked 5 years on The Wire. And that's where I learned how to be a writer and television writer and producer. And so that's a little background, but now I'm going to answer your question. Is the biggest adjustment for me was working with other writers in a room that was that could get contentious at times. There was a lot of testosterone in that room, and it was a lot of guys, including me, who thought we were the best writer in the room, and which is, really what you want. You want a bunch of people who think that they're the best and competitive, and they want to write the best scripts. That's what you want to get out of it. But it was difficult for me at first because, in a writing school like the Iowa Writers Workshop, for example, that's what you do every day. You're in a room with other writers and they critique your work. Well, nobody had ever done that with me before, and I didn't really like it. That was a little difficult to get used to, but it also put a chip on my shoulder in the sense that I wanted to get better. I wanted to get better so that when I wrote a script, the more that I wanted to get as much as what I wrote into the final script, rather than turn in a script and then see it later on with only 30% of what I wrote making it to the screen. I wanted to get 90% of what I wrote making it to the screen. And by the third season, I had it wired. I mean, the script that you mentioned that was nominated for an Emmy, which was episode 311, Middle Ground, was pretty much 90-some% me, my draft. And so I learned it, and I learned it because it was selfish. I wanted to be in control of what I was doing.
Right. Well, I'm sure the adjustment to going into a writer's room is insane, especially considering so many of the writers in that specific room were novelists or solo writers or had their own careers outside of television or film prior. That's one of the funniest parts to me, like looking at the list of writers for The Wire and realizing how many of those people that was either their first or one of their first film television projects.
Right. We had Lehane, and I was friends with Dennis Lehane for going back well before that. We had come up together as novelists. Richard Price was the big one. His book Clockers was probably the most influential book on The Wire of any novel that had been written up to that time, and he was sort of a legend. And like I said, we respected each other, but we were all very competitive. And because of that first season, that first episode I wrote in season 1, which was the penultimate episode, and that event that happened in it, the death of Wallace, I had an unofficial deal with David that I would always write the penultimate episode in The Wire. And it happened to be the episode where a lot of things happened. A lot of characters got killed, some big dramatic scenes. And, we used to sit in the room and the guys would say, oh, you're going to give him that. And, here's my script with a bunch of people talking in a room. And you've got Omar and Brother Mazzone stalking Stringer Bell for, you know what I mean? Like they were giving me all the good stuff. And of course, I didn't care.
But with you writing penultimate episodes, at least for season 1, 2, and 3, George, you're responsible for killing a lot of characters on The Wire.
Oh my gosh, I didn't even think about that. Yeah.
Somebody somebody made T-shirts. I think it was probably on Treme because I wrote the episode where Steve Earle got killed on that one too, and somebody made T-shirts with my name on it with a pen, and there was blood coming off the pen. People were wearing them on sets, and they got to the point where people were waiting for the scripts to drop that I had written to see who was going to get killed.
Right, right.
That the actors would find out, oh, George is writing the script. Oh no!
Oh, right,
Am I
exactly.
safe?
Like,
Looking
oh,
around.
God.
Oh gosh!
They got him again. Yeah, right.
Well, we didn't. The thing of it is we have a policy, and today in the shows we're making today as well, is you don't really want to tell the actor that their number's up, and for the simple reason that you don't want people telegraphing their performance. If they know they're going to die in episode 8, it might show up in their performance. So that's a good strategy, except it's not always something that the actors like, and because in effect you're giving them a pink slip when that script drops.
But yeah, it's definitely the big difference between at least theater and TV, where like in theater you read the entirety of the script and in order to understand the given circumstances, as opposed to in TV where a lot of it is informed just from the first script you get and from the writers and or directors. Is that like an accurate statement to make, would you say?
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. And you can't feel bad because these people we're talking about, like Michael B. Jordan and Idris Elba and Michael K. Williams, they've all done very well in life.
Yeah.
I mean,
it's not like you're kicking them to the curb. Yeah, you're sending them off with plenty in their pocket. Yeah, they know what they're doing.
Yeah, they're doing great.
You were talking about writing in this room with all of these incredible writers, even if you didn't realize it at first, or maybe you did. Eventually, you got to a place where you realized, oh my gosh, I'm writing with some real legends in here, like a Richard Price, like a David Simon. So, what would you say you learned from them, from writing alongside them? Getting used to a writer's room, having to be in a contributive type setting. What did you learn from the way that they write that influenced the way that you wrote for the rest of your life after?
I just think that being around good writers is always elevates your work. And I think it's probably, in the case of the novelist, it's probably more accurate to say that I learned more from reading their books than I did from reading their scripts. But the combination of that and just the discussions that were in the writer's room really made you ambitious, made you want to be a better writer. And it did make you a better writer because, when you're alone writing a novel, as I had been for many years, it's only my ideas that are driving the narrative and the characters. And when you're in a room with a lot of smart people, it's everybody's ideas that are contributing to what you write. And so I think that I became a better writer working on that show, being around all these people, and also, which a lot of writers don't want to talk about, is that screenwriting is a very useful thing for a novelist too, because it disciplines you to write, to try to convey emotions through dialogue and action rather than the crutches of backstory, internal monologue, that kind of thing. It just makes you better, and makes you leaner and just all around better. And the other thing that I want to dispel is that because we had some people come through, not on that show, but on other shows I've done, where we've had some novelists come through who came in and said, this is going to be easy. Like I'm a literary novelist. This is just action and words. I'll do this in my sleep. And honestly, those people never made it. They didn't make it as screenwriters because they didn't respect it enough. And it demands respect, because in many ways, screenwriting, for the reasons that I just gave you, is harder in a lot of ways than writing a novel. And the good ones, like Simon and Richard Price and Lahane, they sweat just as hard. They sweat blood writing a script as they do when they write a novel or a book, because of the intent. And the intent is they want it to be as good, and I want my scripts to be as good as anything I publish as a novel.
And it's fascinating that you're talking about the ability to translate what or adapt your skills from being a novelist to screenwriting, especially because especially The Wire is such an interesting show to do that on, considering when we've talked about this several times on the podcast in reviewing the show, that it has the most interesting relationship with subtext and with silence out of really any show that I've seen. I'm sure, yeah, we talked about that for sure, yeah. That specifically the scene that was happening underneath the scene, as well as moments that you guys had where it was just like exchanging a glance or something, that was maybe the juiciest part of the entire episode, that I'm sure like is such a skill that you can put into writing novels, but that is not something that just comes directly from writing novels. Like that's a very specifically The Wire thing that I've had to start trying to practice on in the stuff that I'm writing, that I'm like, oh God, that's a good idea. I should play with that.
You've got a lot of help when you're a screenwriter on, let's say, on a television show. Let's narrow it down. You've got a lot of help. This is another thing that writers don't like to admit, but crew, the DP, the director, the actors, especially the talent, they elevate your work. It might be just okay on the page, but then you've got all these people helping you later on to elevate it. And I'll give you an example. Is the in Middle Ground in 311. Probably the best thing I ever wrote, and maybe the best thing I've ever written, is that scene between Avon and Stringer Bell on the roof when they're saying goodbye to each other.
Oh God, yeah.
I mean, that's where the subtext is probably the hottest during the entirety of the show.
Right. And I just told you that I thought it was really good writing, humbly, but I'm just saying that it was, okay? But if you look at that, you've got two tremendous actors taking those words and putting them up to another level. And you've got the director, Joe Chappelle, the way he shot it, the way he used the lenses that he used. If you watch it again, he used long lenses at time to flatten it out, and all you see is the colors of the city, but behind these guys as they're doing their dialogue back and forth. And that's the magic of filmmaking, is what it can do to writing. So I'm just got to give credit to a lot of people for that.
Yeah, especially on, well, really all the shows you've been a part of, the Wire, Treme, the Deuce, they all seem to have a general tone of collaboration. Like every single interview that I've seen from every person on all those shows talk nonstop about how they feel very helped. Like everyone's actually, like you use the word help, that everyone's actually contributing in each other's jobs. Yes, everyone has like this is the writer and this is the actor, but at the end of the day, everyone seems to have like a really decent relationship with everyone else. And that doesn't sound incredibly normal. Like that's always the case. Like the actors don't always see the writers, but it seems like that's pretty consistently the case with a lot of projects that we've seen of yours and David Simon's.
We're pretty focused on what we're doing, and you don't see us like some other people that have these big deals at the streamers and the cablers and all that have like 3 or 4 shows going at once. We do one thing at a time. When we're shooting, if David and I are partners, one of us is on set every single day from call to wrap, and if I'm on set, David's in the editing room, and vice versa. Like we're on top of it, and we've got a tremendous producer that's been with us on all these shows Nina Noble, who really runs everything. And but we just believe that you got to be there. You've got to be there watching everything, and by example, people see you there and they know that you care, and they work harder too for that reason.
In the context of the Greeks in season 2 of The Wire, at least from the writer to actor relationship, how much were you there? Not necessarily were you there, but how much consultation, I think I would say, would you give for the actors in order to aid their performance and aid the overall storytelling from the show?
In what respect? Are you talking about just the Greek stuff?
I guess, yeah, specifically like the Greeks, and combined with your Greek background and the fact that your father, and by extension, soon yourself, owned a diner, and they also had scenes take place in a diner. Like little things like that, how much say, I suppose, did you have in the little things?
I think, well, one thing, if David was here right now, I know exactly what he'd say is that there was that diner in the season 2, Johnny's Diner, and we always met, stuff like that. And the first time I walked on set, I said to David, this is bullshit. Like a Greek would never own a dirty place like this. He always brings that up. You know, why was I so focused on that? But uh, I just was, and the same thing in Leon, Leon's Diner in the Deuce, which was a big set for us. I was always very focused on what, because I grew up in a place like that. You know what I mean? And a lot of the actors, sometimes I would write dialogue, but I'd have to call my mom, and my mom was still alive at the time, and she was fluent in Greek. I'm not 100% fluent, but she was. If I had something really difficult or colloquial, I would call her, and sometimes I'd call her from set because an actor would have a question about it. How can I say this differently? That kind of thing. And I had her on call, and some of my other Greek friends were on call too. And yeah, I was on it.
The diner that your father used to own, is that a restaurant that you still frequent?
Well, it recently was gutted during the pandemic. The guy who had it after my dad finally left, and they pulled it out. But I used and I used to go down there a couple, up until then, I went down there a couple times a year, and I would sit at the counter, and because it looked the same as it did in the 60s and the 70s, it hadn't really changed anything. And the lights that were over the counter, my dad and I hung them together when I was a kid, that kind of thing. And it was a way for me to go back and see my dad again, in a way, because I could, in a way, I could feel his presence there. And to go down there now and during the pandemic, because I walk around a lot downtown, and to see it stripped and empty was sort of a shock. But that happens, honestly, if you stay in one place your whole life, one by one, everything seems to go away, and it's a difficult thing to deal with. Um, that people that leave and don't look back never have to deal with, because all over the city now things are disappearing that I knew when I was coming up. So
And I think there's something really nice about novels, about TV shows, about all different varieties and forms of art, and how they are like these time capsules that can always represent like the time that they were written in and the time they represent. And so kind of in turn, when you also wrote for The Pacific, the miniseries, how deeply personal and how excited were you to be a part of that work as also like an homage to your father?
yeah, my dad had fought as a Marine in the Pacific in the Philippines, and when it's the first job I ever went after. I called my agent and said, I want to get on that show. It's the only time I've ever done that before or since. And so I did get on it, and my dad was, at the end of his life, and he knew that I was doing it. He never got to see it, but he knew that I was doing it, and that was the purpose of it. Um, so yeah, it was a tremendous honor to be able to do that for him, and I think the show's pretty good. So
That can go without being said. Yeah, absolutely.
In the case of that show, also, did you inject a little bit of your father, or maybe the stories that your father told you into the storytelling that was this show?
I tried to, yeah. I mean, I'm pretty sure I was the only guy on that show who had somebody in their family who served in the Pacific, and I had known his friends, and who many of whom were also Marines that had been there, and so the episode they had already beat out most of the stuff when I got there, and I asked for the episode that is not a combat episode at all. It's a very quiet episode the where the Marines go to Melbourne in Australia and they're on leave, and I asked for that because I wanted to write. There's a huge Greek population in Melbourne. It's actually the biggest Greek population in the world outside of Athens, Greece. And I, having read up on it, I knew that the Marines, many of them had met Greek girls while they were there. The Australian men were gone at war in other theaters, and the Marines were there, and they were dating Australian women, and then a lot of these guys dated Greek women, and they got taken into Greek families and were fed very well and cared for and so on. And I wanted to write about that, and that was really my contribution to the show.
George, before we get you out of here, thank you so much for joining us. Is there anything you would like to promote?
Yeah, a couple things. I have a movie that I made called DC Noir that is based on my short stories, and I directed one of them. My son directed. Nick Pelecanos directed another. Banga Akinabi, who's people know as Chris Partlow on The Wire, and Larry Brown on The Deuce. He directed one, and a guy named Stephen Kinagopoulos directed another one. That's on Amazon Prime. If you get that, you can watch it. And it's been announced that we're doing David and I are doing a new show in Baltimore. We start shooting this summer. It's called We Own the City, and it's based on the book of the same name about a police situation, let's say, in Baltimore that was a national story. I can't say much more than that, but that'll be coming to HBO in 2022.
We are extremely thrilled about that, by the way. Very, very excited to see what happens there. And one more thing before we finish up. You use basketball a lot throughout a lot of your stories, I noticed. So I'm endlessly curious. Are you a Wizards fan?
Yeah, I'm a Wizards fan. Sure, I'm a Wizards fan. Yeah, I mean, I've been a lifelong Knicks fan too since I was a kid because of the great Knicks team that was Clyde Frazier, Roman Rowe, Dave DeBusschere, Bill Bradley, and Willis Reed.
Hell yeah! There we go.
But I do love the Wizards, and they're going to make a playoff run.
Looking like it. I mean, those are two pretty decent teams.
And Bradley Beal's amazing.
Bradley Beal's amazing, and the Knicks are having a legendary run.
Superstar Westbrook's lighting it up. It's good.
Yeah, it's great time to be a Wizards and a Knicks fan. Congratulations on that one too. All right, well, thank you so much for joining us today, man.
My pleasure. Thanks a lot.
Absolutely.
Thank you, George.